What would you do if you found $270 million hidden beneath an abandoned mansion at a time when nearly 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency and over 100 million are drowning in medical debt? Would you turn it in knowing that most recovered funds never reach the people who were hurt? Would you keep it, even though dirty money has a way of pulling lives apart? Or would you try to transform it, turning something born from corruption into the one thing millions of families like yours desperately need? Hope? Tonight, I want to tell you a story that feels shockingly real. A single mother named Lena Morales, living in a country where rent rises faster than paychecks, where asthma medication can cost more than groceries, where kindness often goes unnoticed until the moment it changes everything. So, settle in, because this isn't a fairy tale about luck. It's a question about who we become when life hands us something impossible. Let's begin. Most people think life changes with a miracle, winning the lottery, meeting the right person, landing the perfect job. But for Lena Morales, life changed because of something far quieter. A manila envelope dropped through the mail slot of a cramped, mold-scented apartment at 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. And before you hear the rest, let me ask you something simple but uncomfortable. How far would you go to protect your child if the only way to save them meant breaking the law? That morning, Lena was standing in the dark, her hands still trembling from another night shift at the nursing home. Her sneakers were wet from mopping a hallway where rain kept leaking through a broken ceiling. Her back ached, her fingers cracked from bleach. She hadn't eaten dinner, she hadn't slept, she hadn't paid the electric bill. And her son, Mateo, 8 years old, still clutching an inhaler like a second heartbeat, was asleep in the next room, unaware that his mother was silently choosing which bill not to pay this month. Again, that's the kind of exhaustion that burrows into your bones. Not tired, tired of being tired. And that envelope, it didn't look special. No stamp, no return address, just her name, written in a shaky cursive nobody uses anymore. Inside was a letter that didn't make sense, a name she barely remembered, a house she'd never seen, a dead man saying she was the sole heir to everything he owned. And in that moment, standing in her kitchen, lit only by the buzzing refrigerator light, she felt the first spark of danger, like someone had struck a match in a room soaked in gasoline. But this isn't about inheritance. It's about the question that came after, a question most of us will never face, but all of us are afraid of. If you discovered a massive fortune, money tied to sins bigger than anything you've ever imagined, would you walk away? Or would you take it and try to make the world better with it, even if doing so put a target on your back? Think about that for a moment. Really think. Every American knows the feeling of the system pressing down. Unpaid medical bills, impossible housing costs, the fear of one emergency destroying everything you've built. Lena lived that reality. And when she learned where the money came from, how it had been hidden, why it had been left to her, she understood she wasn't holding a gift. She was holding a curse wrapped in opportunity. And that's where our story begins. A woman with scars most people never see. A child whose lungs fight against dust and cold every night. And a secret that could either save them or destroy them. Because the moment Lena opened that envelope, something inside her whispered a truth she didn't want to believe. No matter what choice you make next, Someone is going to get hurt. Now let's go back to the beginning. Back to the moment she first met the man who would change her fate without ever meaning to. Long before the envelope arrived, long before Lena ever imagined inheriting anything except debt, the moment that changed her life happened in a hallway most people walk through without noticing the smell of bleach, sadness, or time. It was 2 years earlier, at 2:17 a.m., during her night shift at St. Gabriel's Care Center, a place where the lights always flickered and the air always carried the heaviness of endings. Lena was pushing her mop bucket, half asleep, thinking about whether she had enough gas to make it home when she heard a sound she couldn't ignore. Wood clattering against tile, followed by a sharp, pained inhale. She rounded the corner and saw him, a thin, elderly man in a worn Air Force jacket, collapsed halfway between the nurse's station and the vending machine. His walking cane had skidded across the floor, and one hand was pressed to his chest, as if he was afraid his heart might slip out of rhythm and forget its job. And here's the thing. 3 nurses walked right past him, not out of cruelty, but exhaustion. Overworked, understaffed, beyond capacity, everyone in that hallway had been running on fumes for months. But Lena stopped. Not because she was a hero, not because she had time, not because she wasn't exhausted. She stopped because someone had to. "Sir, don't move," she whispered, kneeling beside him. His breathing was ragged, but when he looked up at her, there was something sharp in his eyes, awareness, even fear, like he'd spent a lifetime staying alert, even when his body could no longer keep up. She helped him sit, slowly, carefully, ignoring the stabbing pain in her wrists. She got him water. She called the nurse, waited with him, until the panic faded from his eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, surprised. "No one stops anymore," he said. "People don't see each other." Lena laughed, the kind of laugh you use to hold back tears. "I see you," she told him. "That's enough for tonight." They talked while waiting for the nurse, about the weather, about Mateo, about how Lena once dreamed of becoming a paramedic before life sent her spiraling into responsibilities she never chose. He told her his name was Captain Raymond Holt, though he preferred Ray. He told her he had flown cargo missions no one ever talked about, and that he had lived long enough to watch the world forget men like him. And then, almost shyly, he asked, "Do you ever feel like life keeps taking things from you faster than you can replace them?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. But here's the part she never forgot. Before the nurse led him away, Ray squeezed her hand with surprising strength and said, "You have a good heart, Miss Morales. The world is cruel, but people like you keep it from collapsing." She went back to mopping. He went back to being another anonymous patient in another overcrowded facility. And life carried on, exactly as it had before, hard, relentless, unchanging. Lena didn't think about that night again. She didn't think about Ray again. She didn't know that while she forgot him, he never forgot her. She didn't know that in the following months, Captain Holt would make choices that would pull her life out of the shadows and into a storm bigger than anything she'd ever faced. She didn't know that a dying man, burdened by decades of secrets, would look at a woman covered in cleaning chemicals and say to himself, "She is the one." That moment in the hallway didn't feel important at the time. But sometimes life's turning points are quiet, so quiet you don't hear them, until they echo back years later. And the echo was coming for her. It would arrive in a plain envelope. It would open a door she didn't know existed. And it would lead her to a house that should never have belonged to someone like her. Now, let's step into the moment. The past finally caught up with her. The morning the envelope arrived. The morning the envelope arrived didn't feel special. It felt like every other morning in Lena Morales' life. Heavy, rushed, and stitched together by the fragile hope that nothing else would go wrong. The sun hadn't even risen yet. The apartment was cold because the heater had quit 2 nights before. Mateo was coughing, curled under blankets that smelled faintly of detergent samples Lena had saved from her cleaning jobs. And Lena, eyes burning, legs aching, was counting the crumpled bills in her wallet, trying to decide whether she'd buy gas or groceries that day. Then came the sound, a soft tap-ch-k, paper sliding through the old metal mail slot. One envelope, manila, thin, ordinary. But ordinary things can carry extraordinary weight. Lena picked it up while balancing her coffee mug, fully prepared to toss it into the junk pile with the coupons she'd never use and the credit card offers she'd never qualify for. But then she saw it, her name, handwritten in elegant, almost old-fashioned cursive, the kind that makes you pause because nobody writes like that anymore unless what they're sending means something. Inside was a letter from a law firm she'd never heard of, the kind of letter people like her didn't receive, a letter that began with 6 words capable of rewiring a person's life. You are the sole beneficiary of... She read it once, twice, a third time. Her brain refused to register the meaning. An estate, a property, 47 acres of land on the outskirts of Phoenix, a house, no, a mansion, valued at over $3 million, and the name of the man who left it to her stopped her breath halfway through her chest. Captain Raymond Holt, the stranger she'd helped once, the man she never saw again. Lena laughed, the soft, trembling kind of laugh that spills out when reality stops making sense. She thought it was a scam, a mistake, a cruel joke. People like her didn't inherit mansions. People like her inherited medical bills and eviction notices and generational exhaustion. But curiosity has a way of grabbing the arm of even the most exhausted soul. So, 3 days later, after borrowing her neighbor's truck and packing Mateo a bag of snacks and inhalers, Lena drove toward the address printed in thick official letters. The road grew emptier as they climbed into the desert hills. No strip malls, no gas stations, just cactus fields stretching toward the horizon, and a silence so thick it felt like entering another world. When they reached the pillars, 2 towering stone columns, cracked with age, flanking a long gravel driveway. Mateo whispered, "Is this ours?" Lena didn't know how to answer. She didn't feel ownership. She felt intrusion, like she was stepping into a life built for someone wealthier, someone cleaner, someone who'd never had to choose between paying rent or buying asthma medication. The driveway seemed to go on forever, winding through wild overgrowth that once must have been manicured gardens. When the mansion finally appeared, it rose like a ghost of old money, Mediterranean arches, a terracotta roof faded by decades of heat, windows dark with dust, a fountain in the circular drive, choked with dead leaves. It was beautiful and broken, like something out of a forgotten chapter of someone else's story. When Lena pushed open the front door, the hinges groaned like the house itself was waking from a long sleep. Inside, dust floated like tiny ghosts in the beams of sunlight, slipping through the curtains. Sheets covered the furniture, shapes frozen beneath white cloth, waiting to be remembered. Mateo clung to her hand. "Mama," he whispered, "are we allowed to be here?" I I think so," she whispered back, though her heart disagreed. They wandered through echoing hallways, past portraits of people Lena didn't know, into rooms larger than her entire apartment. Everything felt too big, too quiet, too heavy, with unfinished stories. But it wasn't until they reached the captain's study, untouched, personal, full of a life that had been lived and lost, that Lena understood this wasn't just a gift. It was a message, a warning, a responsibility. Because on a shelf behind the captain's desk was a framed photograph of him in his younger years, smiling, confident, and beside it a worn leather notebook with her name tucked between the pages, as if he'd known she would one day stand exactly where she was standing now. And as the desert wind brushed along the outside walls, Lena felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Not fear, not hope, but the sense that destiny had just placed its hand on her shoulder. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this mansion held more than memories. It held secrets, the kind of secrets that rewrite moral boundaries and destroy the people who aren't ready for the truth. Now, follow me down one more hallway, to the door that should have stayed locked forever. The first sign that something was wrong came from a sound no house that quiet should make. A low, mechanical hum, steady and patient, like a machine waiting decades for someone to return. Lena heard it on their second visit, when she brought Mateo back with a backpack full of snacks and a list of things she hoped to clean. The mansion was overwhelming, but she told herself that maybe, just maybe, this strange inheritance could become a fresh start. A rare stroke of luck finally coming her way. But luck doesn't hum. Secrets do. It was Mateo who found the door. He was chasing a dust bunny near the kitchen cabinets when he tapped on what he thought was a pantry wall. It didn't sound hollow. It sounded wrong, solid, heavy, like there was another world behind it. "Mom," he whispered, eyes wide. "There's something here." Lena pressed her ear to the seam of the wall. The hum grew louder, steady, electrical, deliberate. She pushed. Nothing. She pulled at the edges. Nothing. It wasn't until she noticed a faint scratch in the wood, like someone had once pried at it with trembling hands, that she felt the subtle give, a soft click. And the wall opened inward, revealing a narrow staircase, spiraling into darkness. Her breath hitched. Houses like this weren't supposed to have cellars, not in Arizona, where the ground shifts and cracks. Whatever was down there wasn't meant to be found. Still, she went down. Because fear is powerful, but curiosity, especially the curiosity of a woman who's had nothing to lose for most of her adult life, is stronger. The staircase led to a steel door, massive and industrial, with a keypad, card reader, and a thick wheel handle like something from a Cold War fallout shelter. It looked absurdly out of place beneath the abandoned mansion, like two worlds had been stitched together. Wealth above, secrets below. Lena searched for answers. She rifled through drawers in the study until she found a small metal lockbox filled with old dog tags, discharge papers, and a single key card wrapped in a faded handkerchief. She took it with trembling fingers, walked back to the basement, and held the card against the reader. The machine beeped. The lock flashed green, and the vault door unlocked with a heavy breathless sigh. What she saw inside didn't make sense at first. Rows of metal shelving, stacks of sealed duffel bags, bundles of $100 bills wrapped in brittle bank tape, crisp, untouched, yet aged like they'd been frozen in time, and handwritten inventory lists clipped to each row. She pulled out one slip and read it aloud. Shelf A, $18,000. Shelf B, $22,450,000. Shelf C, $200,000. The numbers kept rising. Her knees buckled halfway through the count. When she reached the final line, the total amount, her breath left her body so fast she thought she might faint. $270,800,000. $270 million. Hidden beneath a house no one visited, left behind by a man she barely knew. Then she found the envelope. Her name, written in the same elegant cursive as the letter that had started everything. Inside was a folded note and a small flash drive. The note wasn't long. No flowery language, no justifications. Just a dying man's attempt to lighten a burden he'd carried for too many years. Lena, this money was never meant to exist. It was taken during missions that were never meant to be recorded, by men who were never meant to speak of them. I kept it hidden because turning it in meant turning a blind eye to the damage it came from. And I could not spend it, knowing what it represented. I believe you'll know what to do with it. Ray. Lena read it again and again, her hand shaking so violently the paper rustled against her fingers. She knew enough to recognize what this was. Not stolen money, not lottery money, but ghost money. Funds born from operations no government would admit to, from conflicts swept under rugs, from deals that blurred lines between necessity and wrongdoing. Money that wasn't supposed to see sunlight. Money that carried the weight of lives lost, promises broken, and history rewritten by people in power. For a moment, Lena imagined what that kind of money could do. Medical bills gone, rent paid, therapy for Mateo, a life where every breath wasn't a financial gamble. But just as quickly came the terror, the moral pressure, the awareness that even touching this fortune could shatter everything she'd fought to protect. Yet, deep inside her, beneath the fear, the disbelief, the sense of being wildly out of her depth, something else stirred. A question, a possibility. What if dirty money could be turned into clean hope? What if she didn't have to repeat the sins that created it? But good intentions don't erase danger. And the deeper she stared into that vault, the more she realized she wasn't the only one who might be looking for this money. People don't hide nearly $300 million without expecting someone, someday, to come searching. And someone was already on their way. To understand how quickly things would spiral, we need to look at something even more fragile than a vault full of cash. The human conscience, pressed between survival and morality. Lena didn't touch the money for days. She couldn't. Every time she opened the door to that vault, the cold air inside felt like it was breathing against her skin, almost warning her. She would stand there, staring at those perfectly stacked bills, listening to the quiet hum of the lights overhead, and feel an ache inside her chest that wasn't greed, wasn't excitement. It was fear, wrapped around responsibility. The kind of fear that comes when life hands you a choice you're not ready to make. Because what do you do when the very thing that could save your child might ruin your soul? The moral crossroads hit her hardest one morning when she and Mateo were in a cramped drugstore aisle. He was wheezing again. She held a box of inhalers in her hand, $734 before insurance she didn't have. Behind her, a mother was arguing with her insurance over a denied prescription. In front of her, an older veteran was counting coins to pay for blood pressure medication. Everywhere she turned, she saw stories like hers. People crushed under bills, under debt, under a system that demanded everything and gave very little back. And downstairs sat $250 million doing absolutely nothing. Money that could fix all of this. Money that could save lives. Money that shouldn't even exist. That night, unable to breathe under the weight of it all, Lena sought advice. Not from someone wealthy or powerful, but from someone who had always been steady in her life. Pastor Miriam, a gentle woman in her 70s who ran the food pantry where Lena sometimes volunteered. When Lena finally admitted the truth, carefully, vaguely, without details, Miriam didn't flinch. She listened with that quiet patience only people who have lived through decades of human suffering can master. Then she said softly, "Money doesn't start out clean or dirty, child. People decide what it becomes, but deciding carries consequences. And consequences don't care about intentions." Later that week, seeking a different perspective, Lena stopped by a community center where activists held weekly meetings about housing rights. She listened from the back as one speaker talked about government misallocation, corporate scandals, and the countless times recovered funds never reached the people harmed. At the end of the talk, the speaker said something that clung to Lena like a burr. When money comes from injustice, the only moral path forward is to redirect it toward justice. But that wasn't comforting. It was overwhelming. Because if she accepted that belief, then she wasn't just a single mother anymore. She was a steward of something enormous, something dangerous, something tied to history and pain. A lawyer she trusted gave the opposite advice. No matter your intentions, using it is laundering. Reporting it will destroy you financially. Keeping it will destroy you legally. Your safest option is doing nothing. 3 voices, 3 philosophies, 3 moral roads, and none of them fit neatly inside her life. Late one evening, while Mateo slept, she sat alone in the courtyard of the mansion. The wind dragged across the tiles, carrying the smell of dust and old trees. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the future, hers, Mateo's, the future of people she didn't even know. This wasn't a superhero story. This wasn't a chosen one prophecy. This was a woman who had been poor her entire life, being handed a decision that even entire governments struggle to make. And somewhere deep inside, beneath fear and exhaustion, a fragile truth began to bloom. Maybe this moment wasn't about the money at all. Maybe it was about the kind of person she refused to let the world turn her into. But fate, as always, doesn't wait for clarity. While Lena wrestled with the morality of ghost money, forces she didn't even know existed had begun to move. Not everyone believed Captain Holt's fortune should be left to a janitor who once stopped to help him breathe. People with power were already watching. People with blood ties were already plotting. And one determined federal agent had already traced a 30-year-old anomaly straight to the doorstep of Lena's new life. Before Lena could decide what to do with the money, she would first have to survive the people who wanted to claim it. Pressure rarely arrives like a storm. It comes like a slow tightening. One question, one knock, one shadow appearing where there wasn't one before. For Lena Morales, the tightening began with a business card slid under her windshield wiper late one afternoon after leaving the grocery store. A simple white card. No message, no explanation, just a name meticulously printed in bold black letters. Special Agent Harper Cole, Federal Investigations Bureau. At first, she thought it was a mistake, or a prank, or maybe a recruiter for one of those free safety seminars. But when she turned the card over and saw her new address, the address of the abandoned mansion, written neatly on the back, her stomach dropped. Federal agents didn't send calling cards like friendly neighbors. They appeared when something was wrong, and Lena knew, without hearing a single accusation, exactly which vault-shaped secret had awakened their interest. The next day, Agent Cole showed up at the mansion, not with sirens or threats, with questions, the quiet kind that feel almost polite until you realize the ground beneath your feet is shifting. He asked about Captain Holt, about the night she'd helped him, about the inheritance, about whether she had found anything unusual on the property. He spoke with the calm precision of a man who already knew the answers and was simply studying the way she breathed while giving them. It wasn't what he said that frightened her. It was what he didn't say. The pauses, the glances toward the floorboards, the way his eyes lingered on the locked door that led to the basement. Government attention is like gravity, invisible, patient, impossible to outrun. And while she answered carefully, her mind raced with memories of every story she'd read about people who stumbled into things bigger than themselves. Stories where innocence didn't matter once the system decided you were part of a problem. But before she could catch her breath, pressure arrived from the opposite direction, this time wearing perfume, designer heels, and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Her name was Caroline Holt, Captain Holt's estranged niece. She showed up in a black SUV that didn't match the quiet brokenness in her eyes. She didn't knock. She stormed into the courtyard like someone reclaiming stolen territory. Her first sentence wasn't a greeting, it was a verdict. That house should have been mine. Caroline wasn't a villain in the cartoon sense. Her story was soaked in its own kind of violence. Growing up with a father who battled PTSD, a mother trapped in addiction, years of bills, years of loss, years of resentment toward a relative who had the means to help but didn't. She looked at Lena, not with entitlement, but with betrayal, as if fate had played a cruel joke on both of them, but saved the punchline for her. "Why you?" she asked, a question that stung because Lena didn't know the answer either. She didn't feel chosen. She felt trapped. When Caroline threatened legal action, Lena tried to explain she hadn't even touched the money. But the words sounded small against the weight of generational anger. Caroline wasn't just fighting for wealth. She was fighting for closure, for validation, for the belief that suffering should, at some point, be compensated. The tension between them grew like a hairline fracture in glass. Fine, delicate, inevitable. Because in America, where inheritance battles tear families apart every year, where people drag each other into courtrooms over items worth far less than a forgotten fortune, the idea of a stranger inheriting millions was gasoline poured over long-burned wounds. And Lena was now standing between two forces, a government that suspected her and a grieving relative who resented her. Both believed they had a claim. Neither believed she did. Suddenly, her moral dilemma wasn't just philosophical. It was tangible. breathing, circling around her like a tightening cage. The vault that once felt overwhelming now felt dangerous. The house that once felt too big now felt too small to contain the storm building around it. Yet pressure, real pressure, does something strange to the human spirit. It forces clarity. It exposes who you are beneath the fear. And beneath all the panic, all the uncertainty, Lena began to feel something unexpected. Resolve. If people wanted to challenge her right to the inheritance, she needed to decide what that inheritance was. A curse? A blessing? A burden she would crumble under? Or a responsibility she would rise to meet? The only path forward was to choose a purpose, powerful enough to withstand both the government's suspicion and Caroline's fury. A purpose worthy of the man who trusted her with secrets he couldn't carry to the grave. And that purpose would be born in Part 7, where survival becomes strategy. And a frightened single mother begins to step into a role she never imagined claiming. By the time government pressure tightened and Caroline's legal threats grew louder, Lena realized that hiding wasn't an option anymore. Fear could keep her paralyzed, or it could push her towards something bigger than survival. And in one of the most unlikely moments of her life, sitting at the kitchen counter of a mansion she still didn't feel worthy of, she found her answer in the simplest thought. If this money was created from harm, then the only redemption is to heal something. That was the night she called Grace Ito, the only attorney who had ever spoken to her with both honesty and respect. Lena expected to be laughed at when she said the words out loud. "I want to start a foundation." But Grace didn't laugh. She straightened her glasses, opened a legal pad, and said, "Then we build it the right way. Transparent, compliant, and unshakably ethical." And so began the most surreal chapter of Lena's life. Days were filled with paperwork, EIN applications, 501c, 3 filings, governance rules, bylaws written at a dining table once used by a military officer with more secrets than medals. Grace explained oversight committees, conflict of interest clauses, audit requirements, terms Lena had never expected to speak, let alone sign her name under. At night, when Mateo slept, curled against the couch with cartoons still flickering on the screen, Lena drafted the Foundation's mission statement in a notebook she'd bought from the dollar store. Support single parents. Support veterans' families. Support the people the world forgets first. The idea felt fragile at first, too large for her hands. But purpose, once discovered, has a way of making even the most wounded person stand a little taller. Still, the danger never left. Suspicious activity reports began piling up at local banks after Lena tried to open legitimate accounts. Unmarked cars idled outside the property more often. Caroline kept threatening lawsuits, and Agent Harper Cole returned with a warrant, this time not just for questions, but for answers. The moment of collision came in the basement. It was early morning when Cole arrived, badge gleaming in the cold air, flanked by 2 officers and a federal auditor. His expression wasn't angry. It was resigned, like a man tired of chasing shadows, but determined to catch this one. "Ms. Morales," he said, "we need to see what's behind that door." There was no point lying, no point hiding. She had built the Foundation precisely because she refused to operate in darkness. So she placed her hand on the scanner, keyed in the code, and turned the vault wheel with trembling fingers. The door opened. Rows of cash stared back at them like an accusation. For a breathless moment, the room fell silent. Cole exhaled, slow and heavy. The auditor whispered, "My God," and Lena felt the weight of every choice pressing down on her ribcage. But before anyone could speak, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. 3 men, older, weathered, carrying decades of stories in their posture, stepped into the vault. They weren't there by coincidence. They were there because they had served beside Captain Holt on those unrecorded missions, men who had lived with their own fragments of the truth. One of them, a man with a limp and eyes clouded by age, placed a worn folder onto the steel table. "These are the logs," he said, "the real ones." Another added, "Holt never spent a penny. He carried that weight alone because he didn't trust the system, but he trusted her." Documents spilled out, flight paths blacked out of official records, coded transactions, letters Holt had written but never sent. In those pages was the story of money that had never been meant to exist, saved by a man who'd lost faith in authority but not in humanity. Agent Cole sifted through it silently. Then he looked at Lena, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to reluctant respect. "You didn't take this," he said. "You inherited a mess." But even then, the law was the law. No agent could simply turn a blind eye to nearly $300 million. The room filled with quiet conversations, debates, arguments layered with decades of bureaucracy and moral grayness. For hours they deliberated. What do you do with ghost money? Who deserves to wield it? How do you honor justice without rewarding corruption or punishing innocence? And in an unprecedented decision, one that Lena would later learn had required approval far above Cole's pay grade, the government agreed to something extraordinary. The money would not be seized. It would not be quietly absorbed into classified budgets. Instead, every dollar would be transferred into the Morales-Holt Foundation under strict federal oversight, transparent, audited, monitored, used only for public good. When the agents left, Lena remained in the vault, trembling, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming realization that she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. She wasn't simply surviving anymore. She was responsible for something vast, fragile, and profoundly human. The house felt different afterward, lighter somehow, as if the ghosts of the past had finally exhaled. But miracles, even the moral kind, come with consequences. And the world outside the mansion was waiting. Families in need, single parents on the edge, veterans lost in the system. The money would not rest. It would move. It would heal. It would change everything. And that journey, the transformation of dirty money into something undeniably good, would begin in Part 8, where impact becomes legacy and hope starts to ripple outward. The first year of the Morales-Holt Foundation didn't feel like triumph. It felt like learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. Every dollar had to be documented. Every transfer required approval. Every meeting with regulators reminded Lena that this money, no matter how many lives it touched, had been born from shadows. But purpose has a way of turning weight into momentum, and slowly, quietly, something extraordinary began to grow. It started with one family, a young military widow, living out of her car with 2 children, sleeping behind a laundromat, because it was the only place with light after midnight. The foundation placed her in stable housing within 12 hours, paid her child care for 6 months, covered tuition for a certification program that landed her a full-time job at a community hospital. A year later, She wrote a letter addressed simply to Lena, saying, "I thought my life ended the night he died. You proved it didn't." Then came a veteran battling severe PTSD, a man who had survived 3 tours but couldn't survive the weight of returning home. The VA wait list for treatment was 8 months long. The foundation arranged therapy within 8 days. They covered his medication, his transportation, even helped repair the roof of the trailer he lived in so he could sleep without rain dripping onto his bed. Today, he works as a counselor at the very center that once saved him. There was a teen named Ava who grew up in foster care, drifting from home to home the same way Lena once did, smart, anxious, and invisible. The foundation funded her full-ride scholarship, including housing, books, and therapy. 5 years later, she became the program coordinator for a youth mentorship initiative, telling her story to hundreds of kids who needed to hear that broken beginnings don't dictate broken futures. Stories like these multiplied, slowly at first, then relentlessly. By the end of the first year, the foundation had helped 227 families secure stable housing, 318 children receive medical care, 94 veterans access mental health treatment, 62 single parents re-enter the workforce with full scholarships. And that was only the beginning. By year 3, the Hope Fund, as people began calling it, had expanded its reach across Arizona, then across neighboring states. Local news outlets ran stories about emergency rental relief delivered within hours, about single mothers receiving child care support that allowed them to return to school, about veterans whose lives were saved by access to care that never came fast enough through official channels. But the impact wasn't measured just in numbers. It was measured in moments, in a mother crying in the lobby because someone finally said yes instead of "you don't qualify," in a teenager smiling after receiving her first pair of glasses, in a veteran who walked into the foundation shaking from anxiety and walked out with a treatment plan and hope. Of course, not everyone believed in the transformation. Some critics called it redemption propaganda. Some argued that money taken from violence could never become pure. A few even refused help, afraid of the history behind the dollars. And Lena accepted that, because healing doesn't erase the past. It rewrites what the future can be. Through all of it, Lena changed, too. She evolved from a woman who lived paycheck to paycheck into a leader who understood both the fragility and the power of human dignity. But she never let herself forget who she was. She still drove an old car, still tucked coupons into her wallet out of habit, still stayed up at night worrying, not for herself anymore, but for the thousands who depended on the foundation's steady heartbeat. 5 years after unlocking the vault for the first time, Lena walked through the foundation's main office, once a dusty storage room inside the mansion, now a thriving community hub. Staff members greeted her with warmth. Children laughed in the playroom. A single father filled out paperwork for a housing grant. A veteran handed out coffee to new arrivals. It no longer felt like a place built from tragedy. It felt like a place built from rebirth. In the courtyard, under the old mesquite tree, stood a brass plaque bearing a new name, the Morales Holt Hope Center, dedicated to those who were unseen, unheard, and underestimated until now. Lena traced her fingers over the engraved letters, remembering the woman she used to be, the tired janitor mopping floors in a forgotten hallway, unaware that fate was quietly watching her choose kindness. From blood money to hope, from secrecy to service, from survival to legacy. But her journey wasn't finished. There was still one chapter left, one final piece of the story that tied the past, the present, and the future together through a boy who had grown up in the middle of it all. And that chapter begins in part 9, where impact turns into inheritance and a mother's courage becomes her son's compass. 5 years after the vault was opened, the mansion no longer felt like a place haunted by secrets. It felt alive, filled with footsteps, laughter, and the quiet hum of purpose. And woven through it all was the presence of someone who had grown up under its shifting shadows, Eli Morales. Once the fragile little boy with an inhaler clutched to his chest, he now stood tall, broad-shouldered, and calm in a way that suggested he had witnessed more truth than most teenagers ever should. He spent his afternoons volunteering at the foundation, sorting donation boxes and playing with the children whose families came seeking help. He knew their stories, not because someone told him, but because he saw parts of himself in the way they clung to their parents, in the way they watched the world with cautious hope. Sometimes he would kneel down and whisper, "It gets better, I promise." And the kids believed him because his voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through the hardest parts and still chose kindness. Eli had grown into someone gentle, thoughtful, and fiercely aware of the responsibility that had shaped his childhood. He didn't brag, didn't flaunt, didn't act like the son of a woman who oversaw hundreds of millions of dollars in charitable funds. Instead, he asked questions, the kind adults didn't always know how to answer. Why do some kids sleep in shelters? Why do veterans feel forgotten? Why do people have to suffer before anyone helps them? Lena answered him honestly every time because she understood something vital. Legacy isn't money. It's clarity. It's courage. It's knowing where you come from and deciding what you want to become because of it, not despite it. And as Eli grew, so did the foundation's meaning. It wasn't just a structure built from oversight and redemption. It was a living continuation of every sacrifice, every choice, every quiet act of compassion that had brought Lena to this moment. A legacy carried not through wealth, but through intention. One warm afternoon, during the Foundation's annual remembrance ceremony for Captain Holt, Lena gave a speech in the courtyard. Her hands no longer trembled when she held a microphone. Her voice, once small from years of being overlooked, now carried across the gathering with steady grace. She spoke of Holt, not as a hero or a criminal, but as a man who lived in the gray areas of history. She spoke of the hidden choices that shape a life, of the burden of secrets, and of the extraordinary truth she had learned, that redemption is not about erasing the past, but choosing how to transform it. When she finished, Eli stepped forward with a modest wooden plaque he had carved by hand. It read, "For the ones who chose kindness when it cost them something." Lena's eyes filled with tears, not of pain this time, but of recognition, because her son understood the heart of everything she'd tried to build. He understood the weight of their story, not as tragedy, but as a testament to what happens when ordinary people refuse to give up on others. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the courtyard in gold, Lena looked at the crowd. Families healed, veterans supported, young people given new futures. And she felt an ache of gratitude so deep it nearly buckled her. She had not asked for this life. She had not asked for power or responsibility, but somehow, through grief and fear and impossible choices, she had transformed burden into legacy. And now, she turned that legacy toward the viewer, toward you. Because at the end of this story, one question remains. A question that echoes louder than any vault door, any pile of cash, any legal document or news headline. What would you do if life handed you something broken, something heavy, something painful, and asked you to turn it into hope? Would you walk away? Would you try to fix it? Would you risk being misunderstood to do what you believe is right? Stories like Lena's don't demand an answer. They invite reflection. They remind us that morality doesn't live in perfect circumstances. It lives in the messy, complicated choices of ordinary people trying to do their best with what they've been given. So tonight, as you step away from this story, ask yourself gently, honestly, if a moment of impossible choice ever found you, who would you choose to be? And with that, the journey comes full circle, not as an ending, but as a beginning for anyone willing to imagine a world made just a little better by the choices of one brave heart.